So we are on today with design thinking. I'm very excited about this one. I'm learning a lot in this one, and which is great. And my name is Christina McGrath. My company is SwellFit Living. I do optimization of the mind and body with nutrition and movement, fuel and movement. Charles and I have some really cool new things that we're gonna be diving into. So stay tuned for those in the future. But Charles, you're on design thinking.
Yeah. So I'm Charles Leon, one-time designer, one-time bloggist, one-time writer, one-time speaker. But we're on one of my pet subjects tonight, which is, thank you very much, Christina, for allowing me to do this. I hope everybody else allows me to do this, because it's fun. It's really interesting. And I think design thinking now has become a sort of entity in its own right. It means something. It's not just thinking like design or design like thinking. It is design thinking, which is something. Now, in principle, this is really sort of, this has been engendered by a company called IDEO, Tom and David Kelly, who have got lots of theories about how you think, but they're very practical. That's what I love about this. One of the key factors that I completely, well, most of this I agree with, of course, otherwise I wouldn't be presenting it, would I? But one of the key things in all of this is that design isn't just designing things, it's ideas. And it's about people and it's about behavior. It's about changing those things. We only sort of have ideas or have negotiations because we want to change how people think or they behave. The other thing to bear in mind, I'm going to go through exactly what we're going to go through in a moment, but is that design thinking focuses on verbs, on doing things, not nouns. It's not a thing as such, it's a way of doing things, it's a way of being. So there's a lovely quote which is head in the clouds and feet on the ground, that ideas do need action, but you do need ideas and you do need action. And, you know, all of these things, ideas, imagination, they all need willpower and perseverance. There are many other qualities, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. But it is basically about a way of thinking. Now, don't think of it as just design. It can be anything. So I'm going to give you just a little story first to start with. So if you imagine yourselves as a builder that somebody has invited over, and you're asked, you want to build a tower, and you're shown a huge pile of rubble and materials over to the side. Now, what would you do with all that stuff? Well, the first thing you'd probably want to do is you want to know what each material can do. You want to know what its components are, what its capabilities are, what its qualities are. And then you could tell your client just how high you could build his tower. So that's how design thinking basically is structured, and what I'm going to talk about tonight. You have to break it down into the attributes of what is required in order to create any problem solving, any creative thinking, be it design, be it architecture, be it art, be it anything. It's all about human-centered design problems. So tonight we're going to look at 10 personas. Now, personas is a reasonable way to think about it, but you can also think of it as attributes. We can't all get a group or a team of 10 people around to solve any problem. But what we can do is we can know the roles that are necessary and we can play some of those roles. And that's what we do. These 10 are broken down into 3 basic groups. And there's another thing I'm going to talk about, which was also broken down into 3 categories, which is something called the 3M theory, which I'll come to in a moment. But first of all, the 10 personas, which are broken down into 3 groups. First group, the learning personas. This is the behaviorist, the experimenter, and the cross-pollinator. So these are roles that you can play. Behaviorist is observation, the experimenter is prototyping, testing, playing with things, and the cross-pollinator is association. The second category is organizing personas. And a lot of us will identify with a lot of these. One is what we call the hurdler, the collaborator, and the director. And these are people who organize and begin to distill and coagulate and pull everything back together And then finally, of course, once you've got all of that, you've got your ideation, you've got your basic structure of a project, then you have to build it. And then we need 4 different personas. And one is what we call the experience architect. The next is the set designer. Then you have the caregiver. And finally, probably the most important of all, the storyteller. So anyone can be any one of these 10 roles. I'm going to work my way gently through the 10 roles and give you a few examples, because innovation is all about change and changing inspiration and insights, changing insights into action. That's the big thing. It's all about how we manipulate other people's behavior and their emotions. And it's human-centered. Everything we do that we do as human beings is human-centered. So you have to walk in some other personas. So they're not tools. These are ways of being. Does that make sense so far? Hope so. Right, so we'll leap straight in. So the first category is what I call the behaviorist, which they would call the anthropologist. And this is basically defining what the problem is. Now, that means having an open mind. So you must observe, you must probe, it's human-centered. So it's about being emotionally intelligent with your observations, rather than having lots of assuming that you know the answers. It's more about suspending all judgment, observing what you see, and then, which will come up again and again, seeing things with fresh eyes. So you may see the same thing again and again and again and again, but the secret is to suspend all assumptions, all judgment, and to see it fresh, as if it's completely new. So there's a lovely expression which is called vuja day, as opposed to deja vu, which is the opposite. And this is this expression for seeing things for the first time. It's called vuja day, which I think is quite cute. So as another sort of little metaphor, think of it as sort of delving into trash cans, and you've got to look at everything. It's not just the nice stuff and the pretty stuff. You've got to look at all the other things. And there's lots and lots and lots of examples. Perhaps a simple example is this. There was a company in Poland who established a really good quality new soft drink, and they wanted to sell it in railway stations. Now, they had the platforms were on one side and all the shops were on the back. And they realized that people were watching the clocks, then looking at the soft drink stall, and then thinking, have I got time to go? So for them, they observed this behavior and they recorded it. They actually did it with videos. And then they realized that actually if they put their stalls in front of the platforms and with clocks on them, then people could come to them as they were going through. So it was just a very small, subtle change that suddenly sort of, and it grew their company exponentially. The other stupid thing is, of course, Henry Ford said that if you were to have asked people before he started the production line of cars what they really, really, really wanted, most people would have said, well, we just want a faster horse. How can we get a faster horse? But actually, the car was the solution. So you can't crowdfund these sorts of ideas. So number 2 is what I'll call the experimenter. And bear in mind that you have to have all of these skills within a project to make it successful or to create something. So the experimenter is something that we all do day in, day out, sometimes without realizing it's prototyping. We try an idea. We might be washing the dishes and we think, actually, I could do 2 of these at the same time. Let me just have a go and try that. Or I might take a piece of paper and just think, hang on, if I just do it this way, it's got to be rough, it's got to be dirty, it's got to be quick, it's got to be crude, but you have to prototype, you have to test, you have to try ideas. Within that, you have to allow for serendipity. I mean, obviously, Alexander Fleming is the example. With penicillin is that it was an accident, but he had the nous to actually recognize the value of that accident. And it's about process, trying, testing everything, and failing often. You have to accept failure. I was explaining to Christina earlier the WD-40 story. WD-40 is, of course, a sort of spray lubricant grease. I don't know how many people know that WD-40 was called WD-40 because they failed 39 times. And the 40th was successful. So they called it WD-40. I'm not sure what the WD stands for, but it doesn't really matter. So you can do the same thing with experiences. And this is really what it's all about. Even if you're a writer, for instance, you will have to try things to find out how they work with people. You're not a complete silo. You don't work on your own completely and utterly.
And I was going to say, Charles and I were talking just a little bit about this before, but this can also be about you personally. For example, the first one, which was the behaviorist or the archaeologist, whereas when I do my nutrition programs, anthropologist, what did I say? Anyway, anthropologist. Archaeologist.
That's okay.
Either one works. No. So the first one, though, is witnessing what foods you're eating and how they actually affect you. So you're actually being really curious without judgment. So really getting down to the bottom of what feels good and what doesn't feel good. And then the second step is the experimenter. That's when you bring in different foods that could be good. So this could all be in relationship to your habits, to a creative, obviously, design.
But in effect, Christina, this is the scientific process.
Yeah.
The scientific process is try, test, theory, test, until you find by isolation and by optimizing what actually works. I want to, if I can, I just want to read my all-time favorite quote, which is from Samuel Beckett, which is, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. And that for me sort of sums up the experimenter, is that just keep trying, and it will fail, and it will fail. We'll come to a little sort of short story about Dyson in a minute, but I think it was 5,126 times he failed before he got there. So category number 3, attribute number 3, persona number 3 is what we call the cross-pollinator. This is, I think, my personal sort of favorite, in that it's something I love to do, which is juxtaposing different ideas and concepts, bringing association, which is essentially how the brain really works, is it associates ideas all the time. So the simple example of this is Frisbee. Is the Frisbee story, which was basically a pie tin that people started throwing around and then realized, actually, this could make a really great game. So they started playing the game, and of course it took off and became a worldwide sensation. The other obvious example, which I just sort of quickly stick in there, is the printing press, of course, which is based on a wine press. And that was associating the ideas of what you want. So a cross-pollinator brings things together from multiple interests. This is why when I had a larger design company, it's to say to all the designers, whatever you do, you must get out there. You must see everything. You don't know what is going to come in useful or when it's going to come in useful. And it's applying one idea to another and making this wonderful sort of marriage. I mean, again, science is the thing that does this best of all, where you'll see something that does something, and then you'll think, could I apply that principle to this principle to make something new, a completely emergent property? A really good example of this is, of course, metaphorical thinking, is that we all think, not all the time, but we do think metaphorically, and metaphors are the conjoining of two completely disparate ideas into forming a new concept about something. The cross-pollinator has to be somebody who is curious. You have to be open-minded and curious. And you have to sort of cross cultural boundaries. You can't have assumptions and preconceptions of what you're looking at. You have to be open and then just absorb. And then eventually you will conjoin by taking out some of these ideas from here to there. I mean, my example also of this is of course, Einstein, who visualized riding on a light beam. Now, that's the conjunction of sort of 2 or 3 or 4 things with an amazing mathematical mind as well, that then sort of brought him closer to his theories. And it is about patterns. You have to see, then you have to observe first, which is the first category, and then you have to sort of begin to cross-pollinate. So by observation and by seeing the repetition, then you begin to see the patterns. So it's lateral thinking, not linear thinking. Lateral thinking was developed by Edward de Bono in the 60s, I think, and is all about thinking much more broadly, and that awful cliche, think outside the box. Well, there is no box, promise you. There is a box, but it's a round one. It's up here. So that brings me to, I'm gonna share my screen if I can. I'm gonna bring it to the 3, because we'll just take a break from all the personas. The 3M model. Just one moment. Let me get it up on the screen. Yep. Right. So this is the 3M model developed by Jim Quick in his amazing sort of trainings and book called Limitless. He was a brain damaged child who overcame everything, absolutely everything. But so apart from the distilling things into 10 attributes, he's distilled it into 3 attributes, which are the 3 essentials that you have to have in order to learn anything, in order to learn how to learn. And they are mindset. Now, we've spoken, Christina and I, many times about mindset. And mindset is the concept developed by Carol Dweck. It's all about possibility, about what you think you can do, what you believe you can do, about your assumptions, how they hold you back. If you haven't got the right mindset, you've then cut off your possibilities. Motivation is about purpose, about drive. So that will relate a little more to the second of the 3 main sort of categories of 10 personas. But that's about drive, about purpose, about energy, about the action that you take, the resources that you apply to implementing your idea. And the methods are the basic structure. I mean, again, to come back to a scientific method, that will be the structure of your experiments, the structure of everything you look at, you test, and how the processes work. Now, you need all 3 to basically come together to clear your assumptions and beliefs and your shortcomings, to get the motivation, which is the purpose, and then to get the method, which is the process. Now, this I could sort of distill once more, which I really shouldn't, but I will, down to 2 things. There are only 2 real things that we can control. And I accept that perhaps methods is one of them, but I'm going to ignore that, which is attitude and effort. Attitude being how you think, and effort being the amount of resources that you apply to solve problems. Okay, I'm coming back. So, right, ready? So we're going to continue now on to the next section, which is basically the organizing people's personas and attributes. So the first one is what we call the hurdler. So hurdler, very easy image to put into your mind. Hurdlers could run in a straight line and knock down every single hurdle, and they would still have run the race. That's okay. They're problem solvers. Basically, they're problem solvers because they overcome hurdles. Very simple, simple metaphor. So they will turn obstacles into opportunities. Now, the weird thing is, of course, that hurdlers do not run very much slower than sprinters. It's a very, very, very small amount slower, which is unbelievable. However, but they also have persistence. So not only, and you can see how these attributes are now sort of beginning to build into a whole rounded attitude person, whatever. So this brings us to persistence and the Dyson story. As I said, he says he failed. I don't know if it's true. I don't know how he counted everyone. He must have been a really obsessive person. 5,126 failures before 5,127th was success. So he says that then he got it right, but he learned something. That's the key to this, is that he learned from every single failure. So you need a lot of failures. And he says, that's how he finally came up with the solution. He said, so I don't mind failure. No, you've got to fail. He became a billionaire, by the way, which is pretty good going. So it's vision, it's drive, it's pushing, it's optimism, and it's self-belief. And that is the hurdler, really, but risk-taking. Above all things, risk-taking. So if you start combining, so we've got the behaviorist, the experimenter, the cross-pollinator, now we're down to the hurdler. The next one is the collaborator. And this is a bit like the cross-pollinator, except that it's dealing with people and building teams and teamwork. So a quote from Darwin, which is, those who have learned to cooperate and improvise have survived. So it is the theory of evolution right in front of us. But collaborators basically bring teams together. They have cognitive diversity, and they assemble cognitive diversity in successful teams or in successful projects that may even be in the space of an individual. So mixing up ideas, knowledge and skills, and sharing experiences, cross-functional, cross-cultural, team glue. So a brief example is I was invited to work on a project for Intercontinental Hotels some years ago, and they wanted to develop a new brand, and they brought in all sorts of the right kind of people into the project, being a social psychologist, an anthropologist, a statistician, also an architect and a structural engineer, but all sorts of people and a philosopher as well, all sorts of people from different backgrounds to come to see how we could combine together to pool our knowledge, our resources, to create something completely new. That was a really sort of wonderful experience, because instead of me saying, oh, well, you know, I think the restaurant should be like this or like this or like this, they would say, well, you know, emotionally, what is that person feeling when they come into a space? How does it work if philosophically, if they do this? And is it consistent with the brand philosophy, whatever that would be? Anyway, it was a wonderful project. So
I feel that almost comes back to number one, looking at all types of human-centric design. Everybody's looking at it through different lenses.
Each and every category within these personas, each and every single different persona is all part of the same thing, really. They're just aspects of viewing a project. But you will need all of this for design thinking. This is what design thinking is. It's finding a whole rounded human-centric view of not just design, but creativity altogether. Yeah. So, next one. Number 6, this is the director. Right, so we all know what or think we know what a director is, but a director is somebody who builds chemistry, basically, and I like to think of the director as the person who is driving the car, foot on the accelerator, hand on the wheels, and has got everybody in the back with them. So it's about making things happen. It's about sharing and binding together. See, there is quite a bit of crossover, because the collaborator also assembles teams. But the director is the motivator. I mean, think of it like in a movie. He doesn't have to be a film director. Does not have to be the best actor. He doesn't have to be the best cameraman. But he has to bring all those things together and drive them towards a common end. So it's about motivation, about inspiration. It is about leadership, definitely, and responsibility, sort of for the future as well as for the moment as well. One of the sort of very specific things that a director needs to be able to instill in everybody is this ability to brainstorm. And there are lots of techniques. It's something we'd have to talk about another day, about the technique of brainstorming. But again, you need a diversity of culture, a diversity of cognitive diversity as well. There's a nice little trick for anybody that should have bigger projects, let's say, is give it a name. And now we talked about the same with if you have any shortcomings or any assumptions or any sort of mental problems, that you should give them a name, put them aside. But this is not quite the same. So giving a project a name gives it an identity, and that's the reason that you do it. Now, identity means it gives it a personality. That's why I think big military campaigns have a name normally, like Desert Storm, or what was it? Something and awe, shock and awe. I mean, they describe how people should behave and how people should be afraid, or Battle of the Bulge, or whatever it is. They get names. Battle of the Bulge, I think, came after, not before. But give your project a name, give it an identity, because it will become a person in its own right, or a thing in its own right. And if you're gearing yourself towards human-centered design or human-focused design, then you must have a personality for your project. Because projects do have personalities, and creative projects have personalities. So now we're into the builders, the building personalities, personas. So this is the third segment. The first was learning, the second is organizing. Now you need people to come in and start sort of putting the whole project together. I don't know if anybody else has noticed, but a lot of recent art exhibitions, obviously not very recent because there aren't any at the moment, have all been about experience. They've been very experiential. Anthony Gormley did one at the Royal Academy. Olafur Ellison did another, and they were all about immersion, about being involved in the experience rather than just passively viewing. So we don't passively view art now. We're expected to be emotionally engaged with it and behaviorally engaged with it, particularly with Anthony Gormley, where he had all these steel hoops in a room and you had to actually physically climb through them. It's very playful, but it's all about engaging all the senses. So this is the experience architect, the first one in the builders category, that focuses on experience, on human-centered experience. So experience you can almost use as a synonym, but not quite, for emotion. So this is about emotional manipulation, and finding the right trigger points within a project. There's one other person I'd like to mention, if I may, is my great hero, the psychologist Don Norman, who analyzes design, but has given us the basic structure for any piece of design, no matter what it is, architecture, objects, art, anything. There are three basic categories. So we've got yet another three categories. And I've sort of followed this mantra for years, but he says there are three basic ways you need to understand and criticize design. And that the first one is visceral. It has to be emotional. You have to connect with an object. The second one is behavioral. That is that it does what it says, user friendliness. But the third is cultural. And that's where we overlay our stories, and we'll come to the storyteller towards the end. But all of these are based on how you build ideas, how you build projects, and how influential they can be. Depends. I mean, I always take the example of the iPhone. Oh, interesting. Got a message. But because, even before I got one, I was pretty sure I wanted one. Now that's an emotion. And of course, it does behaviorally, it functions phenomenally well. And culturally, I mean, every story in the world I'm in contact with if I need it. So it works on those three levels. And if you take something like Philip Stark's Juicer, which is that famous sort of insect-like or octopus-like juicer, that's all about those three functions. You want one before you even know what it does, and it doesn't really matter what it does. It actually doesn't function all that well, but it's a brilliant idea. But it makes cultural references by the stories, by its shape. So an experienced architect is somebody who maps the journey, and journeys is something that Christina and I are going to talk about another day. particularly the hero's journey, but journeys, of course, in all stories and in all designs, in everything really that anybody creates, it's all about transformation. What you want to do is you want to change somebody or change something. So either emotionally or physically or behaviorally. So it's all about that sort of manipulation as well. And then it comes down to, being real and authenticity as well, and collecting these experiences. That's why a lot of us travel, is to gain experiences and to assemble them. Again, being a sponge, you absorb, you don't know when it's going to be useful. And we regurgitate these things eventually, and then you make the connection with cross-pollinating. So you can't be just one thing, you're many, many things, but these are the basic roles that you need to play, as it were, in design thinking. So the next one is very practical, and where I started my design life is a set designer. And now, for me, set design, the real bit of actually designing spaces, is all completely and utterly, I don't care what anybody says, it's about emotional manipulation, emotional and behavioral manipulation. What we do when we create a space is we are trying to make somebody behave or feel different. Now, if you think of cathedrals, which is my favorite example always, cathedrals were built to absolutely overpower and awe with the power of God and their light and everything else. And they did that with scale, with beauty, with all sorts. I mean, if you were a peasant coming in from rural France or whatever, and you walked into Reims Cathedral or something, you would be completely and utterly overawed by the tininess of your human scale in this enormous, soaring building. And that's really what the stage designer has to create. And that exists in almost everything. You have to create at some point a real environment for things to exist, be it an idea, be it a TV ad, be it whatever it might be. And you have to infuse spaces with identity. And the space, take the space as being slightly sort of metaphorical, in that the space can be any place where anything exists. If you're a writer, of course, then you have to infuse wherever your characters exist with authenticity, with identity. And it becomes very, very important. If you're a painter, even an abstract painter, the environment that you create has to be with its own identity and its own reality and its own consistency as well. So, and I think people underestimate the power of space that we use and how we use it. And obviously, it's something that I've been highly involved in. I want to just read you all the most beautiful quote from the most wonderful, I don't think he's alive anymore, theatre designer, a guy called Josef Swoboda. So he talks about the awesome power of spaces, and I'll just read it to you. When I sit in a theatre and gaze into the dark space of its empty stage, I'm frequently seized by fear that this time I won't manage to penetrate it. I always hope that this fear will never desert me. Without an unending search for the key to the secret of creativity, there is no creativity. It's always necessary to begin again. And that is beautiful. A very beautiful quote, I think. So, have a kindergarten mentality. What do I mean by that? I mean, this could diffuse through all of the different categories, is be playful. Just learn. Picasso said it, of course. He said that you basically have creativity and then you get educated out of it and you have to relearn how to play again. But play with structure. And this comes back to deliberate practice, of course, is the sort of being playful but with deliberate structure. And it is about how humans behave in space. And, you know, we are talking about design thinking, so it is about creative ideas. So it is about human interaction. At the end of the day, you don't buy a drill because you like the drill. You might, but you buy it because you want to drill a hole. That, you know, that's what you want out of it. You want the whole, but if you can get a better looking one, why not? And if it happens to have some cultural references that you really, really like it's red and red is Ferrari and all of that. So we associate things. Right. So moving on swiftly, we're up to number 9 in this category, which is the caregiver. I think I'm saying with Christina, everybody needs a mum, and they're supposed to look after you. I hope that your mum and dad are looking after you, because you need someone who nurtures, someone who. Here's a simple metaphor for this: is that if the oil runs out in your engine, it will grind to a halt. So you need someone who can create that oil, that movement, that fluidity within projects. And it has to be social glue, so not oil, but social glue. Same thing, really. So the role of this person, and we've all played it sometimes, you know, you don't want people to argue, you don't want people to fall out, so you bind them together, you find cajoling words left and right, and you make teams feel valued and interested. And this is a very, very important role because things do fall apart sometimes. And also that then allows people to work together without judgment, without risk of failure, and it lowers the fear threshold as well, massively. So that person, the caregiver, is sort of a sort of curator of interactions, if you like, of human interactions, because at the end of the day, it is all about human beings and building relationships. One of the key roles in all of this, of course, is building a tribe or building a community or building, I mean, I guess it's the same as building a country or whatever. Don't underestimate the ability of somebody, the caregiver, to sort of lubricate the wheels of everything. They're the sort of people who manage expectations. I'll give you just a very short anecdote about many, many years ago. I designed the Grand Hotel Vienna, and they had this wonderful method of managing expectations almost before anybody had actually arrived at the hotel. So what they did, they wanted to be one of the best hotels in Europe, and probably at the time they were nearly there, not quite, because who defines best? I don't know. However, what they did was, when you booked into the hotel, they knew you were coming. They may have sent you a car to the airport, or you may be arriving in a taxi or whatever. They would automatically print you 10 little business cards saying, Mr. Leon staying at the Grand Hotel Vienna, and the number of the hotel, which inevitably, first of all, that binds me to them. They've done something, they've managed my expectation. I have an identity, I have an affinity. So they've worked with that. And one more short example, which was when we went to a conference in New Delhi, we stayed at the Oberoi. And on the, and a friend of ours who was also at the conference came down and said, "You'll never believe what happened." We said, no, what? So she said, well, I went back to my room, and there on the vanity in the bathroom was a tube of toothpaste with a little note written, which said, dear, I can't remember her name, let's say Sally. Dear Sally, we saw that your toothpaste was nearly finished, so we bought you a new tube of the same brand without compliments. And you just think, man, first of all, that's the best example I've ever heard of service, but also of managing expectations. Now, who isn't going to go back to that hotel? Because I will, and I intend to at some point. So we're back down to the last person. Just a quick, very fast recap. We've had the behaviorist or the anthropologist, the experimenter, the cross-pollinator, the hurdler, the collaborator, the director, experience architect, set designer, caregiver, and now we come to the storyteller. At some point, no matter what you're doing, you have to communicate it to somebody or tell somebody about it. And that's where you need a storyteller. Someone who can string together all the elements, and it's a selling exercise. It doesn't matter what it is, or negotiation exercise, let's say. So even if I have an idea and I'm trying to persuade Christina, she's not listening, if I put it into a better story, then hopefully I'll persuade her. And that's part of it. There's a beautiful quote from Muriel Rukeyser, who says, "The universe is made up of stories, not atoms," which I think is just gorgeous. The stories are really the basis of all communication. So if you've got all human reaction within human-centered design, at some point you have to communicate that. And the only way you'll do it is with a story, be it a good story or maybe a bad story, but it is a story. Stories communicate. And TED Talks.
I was going to say, just even with the last story you just shared about the hotel, just that little experience, you don't need to tell me anything about the hotel now. That they have, so that story in itself, besides trying to sell me all the stuff that they have on it, if you just told me that, that's.
But I guess the big example of this is really TED Talks, which, although they do share fantastic ideas, what they really succeeded in was, yes, good ideas, but was telling stories. Everybody has 18 minutes, and they craft everybody. You don't go just to TED Talk and turn up and say whatever you think. They craft you into telling stories. And I can tell you that all those stories always have a slightly emotional edge. They always have some form of transformation. Someone will start somewhere and will end somewhere different. And that may be they come back to where they started, but they are transformed. And that's what stories do. And all businesses, all people, we all tell stories all the time. Because basically that's what we buy into. If I were to sort of talk about brands are totally about the stories behind the brand. It's the stories that we buy into, and that may be authenticity or whatever, or belief or trust, but they're all about stories. And I think, I don't have to go very far to explain that stories change lives, change cultures, and just look at what religion's done all over the world. They're good stories, or most of them are good stories, I think. So I think don't underestimate the power of stories, and particularly if they have emotional content, because then you really begin to touch. One of the stories that always sort of completely blew me away was Steve Jobs, that when he got fired from Apple the first time and went off to Pixar, what he learned was that story was the power of everything. Because before that, his advert for, I can't remember the model of the computer, had, I think they took a two-page advert out in the New York Times with all the attributes and all the qualities and all the speeds and the processing and everything else. And it didn't do very well, and they sacked him. He came back, and what did he do? He'd learned from Pixar, which I know he established, but he learned from the people at Pixar that stories are the heart of everything. And he came back and cut all the crap and realized, right, the advertising campaign is just think different. Just 2 words, and not even necessarily, in quite a lot of them, not even a picture of the computer. Amazing. So stories, and the other thing to sort of mention a bit is that this is from Saint-Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince, is that you don't get perfection by adding on stuff. Perfection is achieved not where there is nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. So you have to pare it down to actually sort of succeed. So the right story at the right time in the right place can be incredibly powerful. I mean, you only have to think of Martin Luther King and I Have a Dream, or so many other sort of wonderful, Ich bin ein Berliner. I mean, speeches, talks, stories change lives, change cultures, change nations. But they do need to be authentic. They do need to be true. And this is part of the whole thing. I mean, the difference between authentic and true, I guess I could illustrate with Titanic is that it might be very easy just to say that, right, the Titanic, the greatest ship ever made with a double hull, left Liverpool and everybody was happy. End of headline, end of story. Well, that's not the whole story, and that's not authentic, because as we know, they had a slight problem on the Atlantic, a bit more than a slight problem. So I think stories are also very critical for any forms of innovation and any forms of creativity. And I think that's pretty much how we communicate everything, by the use of metaphor, by the use of sort of binding together different cultural things. And that's why this role is so important. And I think good storytellers tend to be the greatest salesmen, be that political salesman or product salesman or whatever. They are the people who really, really, really succeed as good storytellers. And as I said, they bind us together, really. So into religion, politics, ideologies, they're all stories, basically. So concepts, I don't think, are ever quite enough. And you need a good story to hook your ideas onto. So having played all these roles, which I will summarize again in a moment, you need a medium to make it work. The medium is the story. Just as an example, fortune cookies. Right. They're probably the worst, well, the second worst biscuit in the world. I mean, they're rubbish. But we all want them. Why do we want them? Because they've got some stupid little story inside them. I mean, I don't know if anybody eats.
They're also for identity, because they're for you.
They are.
You know, it's like...
Well, the thing is, there's stories about you. This is what's going to happen to you. I mean, I've recently released a quiz out to the world. And what I realized in launching a quiz is that it's not the questions that matter. All people really want at the end of the quiz is, what does it say about me? I mean, I could have said, what type of chocolate are you? Or what kind of animal are you? Or what kind of cow are you? And it would have been the same. People would say, well, which one am I? Because I think people are very personally reflective in that sense. And it is all about the self. So fortune cookies are the example of why storytelling works, because we want the story. We don't want the biscuit. They're rubbish, complete rubbish. They're terrible. Anyway, the stories build credibility without any doubt. And stories give permission to explore controversial ideas as well, which is the other thing I love. Did somebody just say that they love fortune cookies to eat? I don't believe. I didn't see that. I saw it just for a second. I don't believe that. The other great thing about stories is their ability to behave like a Trojan horse. So you can, and humor is even better at that. That's why I'm against all sort of comedy censorship and freedom of the press. Well, I'm not against freedom of the press. I uphold it, because this is how we smuggle in new ideas. Now, there is, of course, a danger, an obvious danger, that we get some very bad ideas, and Facebook has been the proof of that, how things can go very wrong. But stories also create heroes, and we're in the process here in the UK, as you are, I think, in the States as well, of reassessing history in the context of what heroes do we really support, and how should we support them, and should we support them at all, or do we need to completely rethink our culture and our cultural values in that sense? One of the things that shocked me in this recently was that the music for Amazing Grace, which was actually written by a slaver. And I didn't know that. Someone who dealt in slaves. And that's, oh, yeah, I really love fortune cookies as well. Well, good luck to you. You need to improve your taste buds, I think. So yeah, so we're reassessing all our history at the moment. And stories change vocabulary, and vocabulary changes how we think, and how we think changes how we behave. So, you know, it's unending, really, and it will always be unending. And I think that quote from Muriel Rukeyser is so right, is that the universe, for us anyway, human-centered people, is made up of stories, not atoms. So, and also stories enable us to make order out of chaos. And, you know, projects, design projects, creative thinking, design thinking, have an enormous tendency just to dissipate into complete and utter chaos. Everybody's got an idea, everybody's got their ego, but stories can begin to bind that together to say, right, what is the cohesive thread within this? And don't ever underestimate, I think, the power of story within design thinking. It's not just design thinking, it's how you should think, without any doubt. So you don't need a whole team of 10 people or more. You can play all the roles yourself, or you can play some of the roles, but you do need to address each one of the roles. And actually what I forgot to do, well, because I was talking so much, was I will publish, or you can download later. So I've compressed them all into just a little slide here, which I will send out with the replay for anybody who wants it. As I say, this is all based around Tom Kelly from IDEO, but it is something that they've developed over about 20, 30 years that I think anyone involved in any sort of project building and creating will probably understand and collaborate with. But I will circulate that after in the replays. So you don't necessarily need everything at the same time. I think that's the other thing to mention, is that you don't have to have all the tools at the same moment in the same space in order to be creative in any way, shape or form. And to some extent also, I think flexibility in these things is more important than pure muscle or strength. So you need to be sort of reasonably flexible, adaptable, and there are other qualities that we can talk about creativity, but as a basic structure, design thinking is probably the best one out there in that sense. There are other structures and there are other methods, and there's, you know, smashing scope, and there's all sorts of other methods for playing with ideas, but most of them focus on the middle part, which is the ideation part, rather than the first part, which is observing and assessing the problems or the thing that you want to solve. And then finally, actually implementation. Implementation is a very big part, which is why I really like the way this sort of goes through the learning process first, then organizing your ideas, deciding what you're going to work with, what you're not going to work with, what you're going to develop, and then finally sort of building the whole structure of your new idea, and then getting it out there. Of course, telling the story is the thing. So that's it. So the mental game is a very, very, very big part of it all. The other thing I put, I don't know why I put it on the end here, but I put get a coach. very simple. Is if you don't know what you're doing, get a coach or a mentor, I should say. Maybe not coach. Coach is not quite.
And that goes along with what we were talking about, deliberate practice.
It does, and also, you know, if you think this is the same process really for let's say an athlete, or for anybody who wants to do anything, be it physical or conceptual. If you're an athlete, well, the first thing you've got to do is basically work out what you're not doing sufficiently right, yes, or you're doing wrong. And that might be your mindset, that might be your physicality, that might be all sorts of things. And then you've got to sort of work out, you know, what, for instance, one little tiny example is that many years ago, I used to be a highboard diver. And one of the things that we were sent out to do, and I believe that they do it with footballers now, is they sent us out to do ballet training. And why ballet training? Because you needed strength and flexibility. And ballet dancers have got that in spades. I mean, they've got it in abundance. So this idea of sort of cross-pollinating in that way, which you have to do. And then eventually you need to start sort of deciding what you're focusing on, how you build it, how you prepare it, and eventually you've got to get out there. And Barry says, and balance. You're right, Barry. So yeah, so get a mentor, get a coach, if particularly with complex projects, but that can be expensive. So don't spend money unnecessarily. And that sort of pretty much sort of sums up one approach to design thinking. There are a few, but that's the main one that we focused on today. And this 3M method as well of mindset, motivation, and method. So hopefully that's useful. As I say, I will publish the outline that I've just gone through, and I will put the 2 slides up as well, and anything else I can think of. That there's a few quotations as well, which I love them. I love quotations. Yeah. So I'll put all that into the replay and send it out to everybody. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
I think that was great, especially in projects and health and sports and everything. It allows you to identify who you are and then almost who you need to fill the niche. So I feel like that's very expansive. That was amazing.
Well, I think also that, you know, personas is the right word, really. Yeah. I try to avoid it, but I can't.
I know.
Because it's not about having people. It's about having
exactly.
personas.
Yeah.
So that
and
does
you can
work.
Filling a lot of different roles. I feel like that's one of the main things.
I think so. And I think the system, the way of looking at things is applicable to anything.
Yes.
Absolutely anything.
I totally agree.
And it gives you many sort of different angles to attack a problem and to structure a solution as well, which is incredibly important, I think.
Yes.
So I've forgotten what's up next.
I believe we're doing the hero's journey.
Ah, yes, of course we are. We're going to follow up on story.
So I cannot wait. I love this. The hero's journey, Joseph Campbell. We'll be talking about possibly you can identify where you are in your own hero's journey next week. So we'll be talking about all of the transformational.
Yeah, that's going to be wonderful. I grew up with sort of mythology, with stories, with all of these things. And it's only sort of in the last 10 years, I think, that I've realized that they all follow a very similar formula.
Yeah.
And the formula is basically running through every single story since time began.
I love it. I love this.
So,
I also love that you can take it and identify it where you might be in your life too. Yeah. So I feel like it's a very cool thing to dive into.
I think
personal growth.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And it will, by the way, it will ruin films forever for you, because you will sit there watching a film and say, I know what's going to happen next. Watch this. Yeah. So anyway,
okay,
lovely
great.
to see everybody, and see you next week. Hopefully.
Yes, thank you so much, you guys.